here is Thomas Hale. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thanks for inviting me for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity. I was sitting back and thinking about the last time that I gave a talk to the club. It's been a long time. It's been almost three plus years that I talked a little bit about the Virginia Mineral Project, and things have evolved very differently from the first conversation that I had with all of you. I do want to just update that, yes, we are working on the second book. The first one was a small team project, but we're hoping to expand that. The Piedmont's a very important province here in Virginia with a lot of famous mines such as Moorfield, the Rutherford. So if anyone has any information, stories, specimens for photographing, let us know. We'd love to have you contribute for the book and get your part in the Virginia mineral history there. It's really been our goal to try to preserve and promote the state's mineral resources, because over time we've really forgotten about them in some cases, besides the mineral clubs. And most of the books are black and white, so if we can bring these things to new audiences, the better. So definitely excited. And yes, we did secure the funding for the second book, so we're very excited to get to work on that starting in the next couple months. But tonight is going to be a little bit different. For those that know me, you've probably always thought about me working on Virginia minerals or Virginia geology, but my day job or my career and academic path has been the nexus, as Cindy said, between minerals, the things that we all love and are passionate about, and international affairs and national security. And where do these two worlds mesh and meet? And I think it's no longer, when I started giving these talks, it was kind of new and not everyone had heard about it. But I think it's hard for anyone, especially after COVID, to turn on the news and at least once a week or once a month hear something about mining or minerals or critical minerals or supply chains. And so tonight's talk is really going to be about introducing you to what's going on and having some conversations about why minerals are important to us. It's talking to an audience that already appreciates minerals, but some of the geopolitical, social, and economic implications of what we love, I'll discuss tonight. So I always like to give a presentation overview. So I'll talk about why minerals matter. Again, the audience here, I think we can understand that at some point, not all groups can see that, but we all love them for their aesthetic qualities, but we'll talk a little bit about their industrial and security implications. I'll talk a little bit about what a supply chain is. We hear that all the time now. You know, I remember in COVID, supply chain was a new buzzword, but now it's all over the news. So we'll look at that. I'll define what I mean by the mineral security nexus, which is something that I've coined and kind of created during my time in academia. And then I'll look at some key issues and introduce you to some concepts such as critical minerals, conflict minerals, rare earth elements, and then some other topics that I think aren't necessarily discussed, but should be in this whole broader theme. Some of these, of course, overlap with one another, but they're important to talk about in their own context. I'll talk about pathways forward, or the pathway forward. I mean, where do we go from here? I mean, we hear it's a problem. We hear that most supply chains are in adversarial control. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? We want to have this energy transition. We want to find a better future, but what is it going to take? And so I'll talk about that. And then the concept that I've also coined, which is mineral diplomacy. How do we use mineral specimens as mineral collectors to get people interested in talking about minerals and learning more about them? Like, what can the mineral community do to contribute to this conversation? And when clubs are looking for new membership, they're looking for engagement, I think this is going to be a great opportunity and time for us as a mineral community to tap into a lot of potential in kind of global conversation. And then recent developments, if I have time, I'll mention some things that have happened in the news the last 2 weeks. And then if anyone would like to talk about it, I have some case studies. I don't know if we'll have time in this session, but would be happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm on the right, here's the metals in a smartphone. If you're not signed up, I highly recommend you sign up to the Visual Capitalist. They have a part they call Elements, and they produce a lot of visualizations around the supply and geology issues. And so this metal in the smartphone is a really, really cool graphic. There's a lot of really interesting things that they put out. So highly recommend signing up to their newsletter, because it's really cool when you can take these abstract concepts and visualize them and think about them in different ways. There's a few elements that are missing. from this, but this is the general core material used in a smartphone. And you can see there's a lot of elements in that periodic table that go into making that device that we use every day. So why do minerals matter, right? Well, I always say that minerals matter because without them, we wouldn't really matter. I mean, society has always had to be able to manipulate, or maybe not the best word, but to be able to use and take advantage of resources, whether they were stone tools, steam locomotives, or now electric vehicles, in order to advance society. Without our ability to harness those resources, where would we be? I always tell people, if I had a magic button, and the moment that I touched that button, everything that had to go through a mineral supply chain, whether from the creation of that material, that product, all the way to your food that gets to your home, the water that gets to your house, if you press that button and all that disappeared, we'd all be sitting in a field right now. We wouldn't be talking to one another virtually. And can you imagine what COVID-19 would have been like if you couldn't have been able to harness the technology to communicate with one another? And so really minerals matter because they're the function and the core foundation of our society. And we often forget about that because as technology advances and as we begin to create smaller products, more advanced technology, it becomes very difficult as a consumer to know exactly what goes into making that product. It was almost very easy to tell what was put in your armor back in the medieval times or went into a steam locomotive. But to be able to know and tell and understand as a consumer or a buyer and goes into electric vehicle or wind turbine, that's very, very difficult. And that's created a detachment that has made us forget about why minerals are so valuable to our everyday life. We also know, and why minerals are becoming more important, that for certain minerals, especially those necessary for this energy transition, there's going to be an increase of 400 to 600% over the next several decades, 20, 30 years. That is a huge percent of increase in demand. And in order to supply that, you're going to have to talk about mining on scales that right now would be unheard of. So how do we accomplish that is a big challenge we'll have to face. It's also important for me to bring awareness that minerals are not just mining. You know, it's not just that mining's the only thing, or they're just aesthetic. They have a huge role to play in decarbonization. They are the fundamental building blocks of climate change and climate mitigation. They are literally the core elements behind the energy transition. You cannot have your wind turbine, you cannot have your solar panel, your EV, your nuclear power plant without minerals and geology. They also have a lot to do with conflict, which is areas that I've worked in within Afghanistan and the Congo, where minerals are sometimes manipulated and used by bad actors to enforce people into slavery, child labor, and other things. So they have some negative implications on that front. And then, of course, there's this larger conversation about consumerism. We want a new iPhone every year. We want a new car every 4 years. We want a new TV. We got to get the best, the best, the best, the best. But what happens to the old? Where does that go? What happens to those materials? We have created a system, a society that consumes, but has forgotten what it takes to consume, which are these minerals that we all think about every day. Us, our group. So we have to think about how do we resolve this? And you'll hear a lot of things in the news about substitutions, alternative sourcing. We got to think about environmental safety. We got to think about recycling. We got to have a circular economy where once the product is done, you recycle and reintegrate it. All of these things are good. They are answers to the problems that we're going to have, but none of them on their own are going to be the solution, because demand, population growth, consumerism are going to be they're going to stress the supply chain so bad over the next 30 years that no one of these are going to solve the problem. You're going to have to implement so many different things at the same time in order to achieve what we want as a future. And that's created a lot of issues. And again, we realize that some minerals become less important over time or more important. Rare earths, for instance, they're more important now than they were 300 years ago. Some elements may become less important today, and then 50 years from now, we find a new application. And guess what? Everyone's going back to mine that specific element. And so minerals matter temporally too. They may not matter today as much as they'll matter tomorrow. And the next day, they may not matter at all. I mean, markets are changing, innovations are happening. And one of the things that I always caution people is when you look at lithium, there's a big conversation about lithium ion batteries, with EVs. There are people working on substitutions to lithium, and those market dynamics are always working, pushing and pulling on one another, and it can change what minerals are important 30 years from now. And so really, at the end of the day, minerals matter because it is essential for our shared future. No matter if you live in the US, you live in Europe, or you live in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, minerals are parts of society that we need. And if you talk about mitigating climate change, bringing people out of poverty, developing other areas, you can't do it without mining. And that is a really hard thing for people to be able to reconcile with when we start asking some of these questions. I like to show this graphic because I think it really emphasizes the challenge that we're having. You can look at the 1700s and look at 2000, and you can see that as technology advances, the amount of minerals and materials that we need also become larger. And so you see this exponential growth in the amount of elements that we are utilizing in the periodic table for our products. But we forget that you didn't have to mine as much to have, a windmill back in the 1700s as you do now to have a wind turbine. And so people sometimes forget that, yes, we are trying to mitigate climate change. Yes, we are trying to have an energy transition, but that is going to be so metal intensive that sometimes those cons of that are going to outweigh the pros. And so thinking about the metal intensity of what we want to accomplish is something we forget about a lot. What is a supply chain? So you may have heard of this in the news. I don't want to make an assumption that you don't know what a supply chain is, but I do want to kind of cover it real briefly here. It's a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product to you, the customer. You always hear about upstream, which is mining, to downstream, which is you, the end user, and the manufacturing. This is kind of a simplified electronic supply chain looking at cobalt. You mine it, it may get traded locally, it may go to another local trader, an international trader will take it, it may go to a smelter, it may go to a producer that produces the components, someone then has to manufacture and put those components together, and then it has to be sold. This is a very generic view because we can get more complex, which is semiconductors. You heard about your vehicles. I'm not expecting you to read all this or look at all this, but you begin to see how many countries are involved, how many players are involved. I think, and I've lost this statistic, so I apologize, so I'll keep the estimate conservative, but you're looking at over 1,000 stops in a supply chain, different nodes of a supply chain to get your semiconductors. That's a lot of points of failure that have to be right, that have to cross borders over 70 some times in order to be able to get to the final destination. And if a political event occurs, a national security event occurs in Taiwan with China, it disrupts the ability to get what you need. And that's why you saw during COVID-19 so many car manufacturers not having the semiconductors. You had cars being made, but they couldn't get that one little tiny chip that made them work. And they're sitting on lots, not being used. And so the supply chains become very complex. As you can see down here, the mining of some of these materials are coming from places like Russia, coming places like China, and look at the Ukraine war. These things create problems. One thing that came up is that 90% of semiconductor grade neon gas used in the laser etching for the wafers within semiconductors, guess where that came from? Ukraine, 90%. When Ukraine conflict occurred, now you have to find a new supplier. You weren't prepared for that, and it disrupts the supply chain. And so we're living in a world where there's the globalization, but globalization creates points of failure that, if conflict occurs, can create problems. And so it's important for us, as those that study geology and security, to understand where we're getting and supplying these materials. This is a really complex view of the cobalt supply chain. I'll give you this. You don't have to read it, but you can see we went from a simple view to a moderate view to now a complex view. And imagine with each little bullet point, you have different governments, you have different companies that have their own structures and dynamics and competitions. You have different refineries and products. You have metal refineries. You have chemical refineries for cobalt. It's just not a metal. It could be salts and oxides. And so you begin to add so much complexity, and people just never thought about it like that. And we kind of woke up one morning and realized that there's so much issue here and how we have these supply chains that we really need to be thinking about the security dynamics of where we source our materials and where they go. And that process has to be monitored in order that we don't have a repeat of COVID-19. So what is the mineral security nexus then, right? The mineral security nexus is what I say is the increasing importance of minerals and the environmental, human, and national security issues, and environmental, national, and human security issues, and the consequences of those dynamics on our ability to acquire them safely, consistently, and securely. 3 different things there, right? These are issues that transcend multiple different problems. For national security, we can think of things like US and China. We can think about, like I talked about, supply chain vulnerabilities. We think about military and defense technology. How do you keep your force modernized when you don't have the proper materials? Someone told me China's not going to take away your ability necessarily to have rare earths, but it can constrain you to where the US military may only be able to have 30% innovation versus 70% innovation in a year because of the constraints on that supply. We also look at things about stockpiling, really big during the during World War II. Which elements should we stockpile? I used to always hear about the fact that during World War II, they would actually have beryl crystals that were sitting in military warehouses, piles of beryl crystals that were used for the beryllium, but they collected them for pegmatites. They separated them out and they put them in stockpiles. And you had mineral specimens technically sitting there. Doesn't mean they were nice specimens that were going to go in a museum, but you get the point. These are things that we look at every day, but don't necessarily equate to these issues. Human security. We can't forget that at the end of the day, there are people involved in these issues. Child labor, human and sex trafficking. When we worked in the Congo, assaults and sex trafficking were increased the closer you got to mine sites. These are issues that are not necessarily talked about, but are prevalent when looking in the Congo and speaking with the community. And these are places where you get the materials for your smartphone. We learn about things like civil wars, the health and safety. A lot of these people do not have proper safety gear and procedures that keep them from getting these toxic metals in their bloodstreams. You can do it safely. It doesn't have to be dangerous, but at this point, it gets very difficult. And it also becomes difficult because artisanal small-scale mining, which you'll hear about in the news as it's bad, it's evil, it is the livelihood for some of these people. These people do not want that to go away. So when you demonize this entire point, there's like 150 million people in the world involved in the artisanal small-scale mining sector. And when you dehumanize these people and you villainize that sector without resolving those underlying problems, you have a massive human security issue, because where do these people go for jobs? Are they going to join insurgency movements? Are they going to join anti-government war parties? These are things that can become problems based off of just what we want and where we source our minerals. That's very interesting. We don't think about that. And then I don't think I have to talk about this much, but really a lot of this is pushed from environmental security, climate change, pollution, energy and technology, the energy and electric transition. Those are really the fundamental aspects here driving it. But I always remind people, no matter your political affiliations, you can't just equate minerals and critical minerals to electric vehicles, because minerals are used in everything. They're used in so much. You can't get the water to your home. The trucks can't bring food to your local grocery store without minerals and metals and materials. So equating it to just an energy transition or just to climate change misses the point. It's about us understanding where we source our resources, what happens at the upstream level, and why we should care about that. That's really the point that I want to make. We can't just say, oh, source it somewhere else, or, oh, this is bad. It's not that easy. So now let's talk about critical minerals, the concept that you hear about a lot in the news. This graphic at the bottom is a little outdated. This is 2019. I have a new list, but I like the way that it kind of showed things here with, you can see different elements and materials used in various industry sectors. John was talking about specific elements. And actually, believe it or not, if you look at this list, you'll notice barite, fluorspar, there are some minerals intermixed with the elements, which makes it very confusing for people because some of them are minerals, some of them are elements, and they just get classified into critical minerals. So it creates this big kind of terminology issue. But critical minerals by the United States Geological Survey are both critical to economic and national security of the country. They're used in a specialized application, but they're at a risk for high risk for supply disruption. As I said, minerals are normally a misnomer. Most of these are elements. What defines that supply risk? There could be a single point of failure. This could be a country or a processing area in a country where if it went down, if a flood occurred, it doesn't have to be security. It could be geohazards, a landslide, an earthquake. If a facility is destroyed or goes into shutdown, that could create a failure in that supply chain. A lot of people, I don't know the terminology necessarily, but it's on demand, right? You get your products on shelves on demand. So if the supply chain's interrupted, it could have rippling effects for a year based off of that one incident. There's also concentrated markets. As you can see here, you can thank the Chinese Communist Party for sourcing your night vision goggles. We used to be able to source that in allied countries, but most of the elements that go into a Navy SEALs night vision goggles, just communication gear, it's global positioning gear, comes from material that has to cycle through China. And when you're looking, whether or not you believe it or not, there are geopolitical issues in this country right now between the two nations. And that creates major issues when you're looking to have your force have the ability to maneuver if those materials can't get to you. If we went to a war and we needed supplies, what would that be like? And you may not have the stockpiles of certain materials that you weren't really thinking about 30 years ago. There's also political dynamics. There could be a coup that happened to China last year or 2 years ago. In Africa, there was a coup and it created a big problem for their bauxite mine where they get the aluminum. That created a massive issue for China. Just-in-time delivery. Thank you, David. There's cyber threats. That's a big issue nowadays. We want to automate the mining sector for safety reasons, but that increases the likelihood that there's cyber threats to mining operations. Geohazards, as I mentioned, and I think we all learned COVID-19. COVID-19 can really disrupt our ability to mine and move material. So really, though, it's important to note that criticality is very fluid and it's very specific to a country. And what I mean by that is it's all about who's asking the question and when they're asking the question. Our critical minerals in the United States may not be the critical minerals of Canada, of the European Union, of Australia. And that creates some differences in the way we do our policies. It also matters when you ask the question. As I kind of alluded to, you can say that the minerals today are not necessarily critical in 5-10 years. These lists are going to change. They're going to be fluid. And when you invest right now politically in a specific element or mineral, quotes, and then 5 years, it's not important anymore because the industry has advanced out of the issues that it was having. Well, what do you do? Because you've invested millions of taxpayer dollars in a material that the industry has kind of moved out of its product because of political issues. So balancing all these things is an issue. And then it's also important to note that private industry has their own critical mineral list. That's pretty wild. We don't really hear or see about that. But there are things like GE, Microsoft, Intel, they actually have internally critical mineral lists, and they don't share their methodologies with the US government. So they may not tell you how they deem criticality, but they do share sometimes critical materials, and this is in their supply chain divisions. We know that since the 1990s, there was a disinvestment within the US mining industry. A lot of our processing facilities shut down, mining moved overseas, and this created an influx of Chinese dominance in the sector from extraction, processing, and manufacturing from the 1990s. And so that's a really pivotal time. That's also the same time the Bureau of Mines was dissolved. So you see this change in policy in the 90s, and a lot of that has created many of these bottlenecks that we now have today in 2023. China, though, if there's one issue that you have to be concerned about, it's going to be in processing. You can manufacture products elsewhere, but companies don't really do that. They want cheap labor. You can mine it elsewhere. There's other deposits. but it's the processing. It's the expertise in knowing the metallurgical process to remove elements out of the rock, to separate these materials. That expertise, that knowledge base has been grown, achieved, and fine-tuned within China over the last 30 years. And building expertise in a field like that is very difficult to do in a scale of 5 to 10 years. It takes time to train new PhDs. It takes time to create experts. And that's the challenge that we have for the future. In 2018, we came out with 35 in February. They came out with 50 total commodities. A lot of that came down to the separation of the rare earth elements that I'll talk about. But there were some additions and different things. You saw the platinum group metals and rare earth elements. I saw that Jeff was talking about platinum group elements. They're separated now, so that's why the numbers increase. You saw the inclusion of zinc and nickel. You probably heard a lot about nickel, especially after some of the issues that happened on the London Stock Exchange with China. And then there was some redactions. There was some removals of uranium, helium, strontium, potash, and rhenium. Uranium was a political decision, but helium's a very interesting one because we removed helium because we had a plant in Texas where we had that gas. And then there was an issue at the plant and it shut down right after this, 2 months after this report came out, and it became critical again. But the list doesn't say it's critical. The policies don't say it's critical, but it just shows you that when you create these documents, something can happen tomorrow that all of a sudden something becomes critical, right? So it creates these big issues. I was also told by some folks at USGS that some of the statistics, when you read some of their reports and their lists, did not include COVID-19 dynamics, which seems crazy, but they're working on data that they have to fine tune and perfect. So there is a time lag there. So not everything that you see today may necessarily be as relevant as we would like it to be. But getting those industry numbers and supply chain numbers are very difficult because not every company wants to be as transparent and release those numbers, which is an issue that we work on. Look at the periodic table. A lot of it's critical. A lot of it's important, but there's a lot of other things that we use like gold, lead, iron, copper. A lot of people complain that copper is not on the list. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like to. That's a big discussion because copper is going to need to be more copper mined in the next 25 years than the last 500, I think they say. It's really essential in all of these different technologies, but is always kind of left out in the discussion. So a lot of critical mineral people always say, we need to have copper in there. If you're not familiar with the USGS National Minerals Information Center, a lot of these people came over from the Bureau of Mines. There's some people that kind of intermixed, but they put out a phenomenal report every year called the Mineral Commodity Summaries that talk about net import reliance, where we're mining materials, where we're sourcing issues. Fantastic report. Not all these numbers are as up to date as I'd like them to be, but it's still a good report nonetheless. They put it out every year. It should be coming out in the next 2 months for 2023. So highly recommend learning more about this center if you want to keep up with issues related to critical minerals. And they're the ones that do the criticality assessment. Again, each country has their own. I think Canada is rocking it. They have a really cool critical minerals list, the maple leaf there. The European Union also has their own. And if you look at the European Union, what you notice is that the defense in space is really small. You can see that renewables is at the top, e-mobility is in the middle, and defense and space is at the bottom. That is a political decision within the European Union where defense is less prioritized as it is in the United States. So there's more priority put on defense applications in the US than it would necessarily be in Canada and the European Union. And so when you're talking about working with allied nations, it becomes a big issue sometimes because they don't necessarily see eye to eye on how you determine criticality and what should be prioritized in your strategic assessment. I want to kind of, as we've been talking about this, remind ourselves what we're talking about here. I mean, there's a lot of our favorite mineral specimens here that are all contain critical minerals or critical elements, or as I just call it, critical materials. So really what we pick up and what we love and we go to Tucson to see and buy, they have elements in it that are useful in educating people about how they're used. And unfortunately, when you go to a museum exhibit, the value of a museum exhibit is normally put on the aesthetic. I will be honest, when I've been in Virginia working with museums and talking to people, most people say minerals are not as engaging as a biology exhibit, as a physics exhibit, as a chemistry exhibit. And I tell people all the time, that's not the minerals problem, that's your problem. Minerals are highly valuable in education and training, especially in today's world where we talk about critical minerals. So using these beautiful specimens are really, really important. Oh, I see Stephanie may have the new one. Great, that just came out. See what happens when you go to Australia for 2 weeks. You get out of the loop. Conflict minerals. That's the second thing I'll talk about just briefly. You've probably heard about conflict minerals a lot longer than you have critical minerals. By the way, critical minerals were called strategic minerals in World War II, so the terminology was changed. But conflict minerals are very specific. They refer to raw materials that come from a particular part of the world where conflict is occurring, and it affects the mining and trading of those materials. And so funding is an essential component. You may have heard of the Dodd-Frank Act, that is Section 1502, that really classifies 3TG: tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, or cassiterite, tantalite, columbite, wolframite, and gold, respectively. Those are the only minerals that are considered conflict minerals or conflict elements, and only in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So the problem is, and a lot of international NGOs and human security groups have said there's so many other places where conflict and minerals are connected. But for the US government and for reporting requirements, really companies only have to worry about that if they're sourcing it from the DRC and they're sourcing tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. So it creates a lot of political issues. I worked on copper and cobalt in the Congo. They're not conflict minerals. So people say that. You'll look at the Washington Post, you'll look at the Hill, you'll look at New York Times, and they'll call them they're not conflict minerals. That is not true, because conflict minerals have to be classified by the US government in a specific way. And I think it was the Obama administration that set up a conflict minerals determination by the State Department. But really, you could expand this list, but the moment you expand this list, there's a whole lot of issues that come up with that. So just note that when you hear that, it's only those 4 minerals or elements, and only in the DRC. There's some issues here that come up. How do we trace conflict minerals is a big problem. There's something called LIBS research, which is happening at the South Dakota School of Mines. And it's called laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. And they're trying to get out in the field and be able to basically plasma etch and get the analysis of the material and the ore bags to determine where it's coming from. So blockchain, LIBS, and other traceability is really the big issue in conflict minerals. You can do it with diamonds. You've probably heard about diamonds and gems and laser etching in different ways to trace, but there's a lot of issues here. And then the artisanal and small scale mining sector, which, Jeff, aren't diamonds sometimes considered conflict? They are, but there's the Kimberley policy or the Kimberley process and all this different thing. That's a whole separate thing. They are called conflict minerals. They can get equated with conflict minerals, but if you look at the policy, they're not. And so what I have here is look at all the different countries like Burma, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Colombia, Zimbabwe, Central African Republic. Diamonds, that's where we're talking about here. They are part of the discussion, but they have different policies. So if you're going to look at it from a political and economic perspective, it's just 3TG, and then diamonds have their own reporting requirement. They're 2 different things. They're separated. We can disagree with that all day long, but that's just the way that it happens. And so in Afghanistan, the Taliban uses emeralds. I was meeting with the former geologist of Afghanistan, and he had been beaten up by the Taliban. The US government got him out of the country. He's at rest in Virginia, and he was talking about they were working with a guy in I think the UK. He was going into Afghanistan trying to compete on the emerald market with the local Taliban warlords. And his guys were getting blown up. They were getting killed and kidnapped, but he was trying to disrupt the conflict market around gems. Now, poppy, of course, is the main finance of the Taliban, but gems were also highly used by the Taliban to source for funds. But what ended up happening is it went into Pakistan, Peshawar, right? You've seen a lot of Pakistan gems. A lot of that material comes from Afghanistan and some of those northern eastern pegmatites. And so one of the statistics says that Pakistan has huge talc exports, but there's not much talc in Afghanistan. And so when I was at the State Department, I was talking to the economic reporter for Afghanistan, and we looked at it and we saw that really it was coming from Afghanistan, but was being reported as coming out of Pakistan. So you can look at the geology sometimes to determine what exactly is coming out of which country, which is really interesting. And then the last one here is rare earth elements. And so this is really the bread and butter of Washington, D.C. If you walk into a room in Washington, D.C., and you talk about critical minerals, the first thing someone's going to tell you is, oh, yeah, rare earths. The reason is because this has really been around since 2011. This is the issue that woke up the U.S. security sector to mineral challenges and mineral supply chain issues, although we kind of fell asleep at the wheel and woke up again when COVID hit. We include here 15 lanthanides and then yttrium and scandium. That's 17 total elements. They're also not rare. There's a lot of misnomers in this literature. I have a great career ahead of me to try to break some myths that people often propagate, but they're not rare. They're just hard to extract, and they're in small quantities, but they're widely distributed, but they're not rare. What all of this came up, though, we can thank, I guess, if you want to think of it that way, a drunk fisherman from China who went into Japanese waters in the Senkaku Islands in 2010. The Japanese Coast Guard arrested this drunk fisherman. That led to a diplomatic dispute between the two countries. At the time, Japan was reliant on sourcing its rare earth elements from China. There was calls for an embargo on rare earths. There's studies that suggest that didn't really happen. But what happened, no matter, the whole market was disrupted. Things went haywire because of the diplomatic dispute between these two countries. And what happened was market prices went crazy, and everyone kind of got big old bushy-eyed and said, oh my gosh, we have a problem. A country can use diplomatic issues or security issues to constrain the flow of resources and create a problem for supply chains globally, because Japan creates a lot of electronic products and magnets. And so that was really the first time we woke up to this because of a drunk fisherman. So we are import reliant on rare earths. This is one of our biggest challenges. We had the Mountain Pass mine in California, but for many years, Mountain Pass would mine the product in the United States and then would ship and pay for the shipping of the product to China, where China would then process. So we would mine it here, but ship it to China to process. And that happens for a lot of elements in other countries as well. China controls around 87% of that global permanent magnet market. They are the experts in rare earth processing. It's hard to find some of the metallurgical processes that don't have some sort of Chinese literature or academia behind it. They have really perfected some of that science, and that creates a lot of issues. There's been a lot of projects. Linus is an Australian company that wants to do it in Texas. There's been a lot of DOE research into coal fly ash from the old coal mining, revitalize these Appalachian communities at the same time getting elements out. And then there's been some new investment in the Mountain Pass prospect or mine. But again, when you hear about this in the news, just because you're putting money doesn't mean that it happened tomorrow. These things may take 5 to 10 years to establish. Then it may take 5 years to impact the supply chain at a significant percent. So some of these investments you see can take 10 to 15 years. And you could ask ourselves, if anyone's been watching the news, there was a foreign policy article from a U.S. general that said that he thought we'd go to war with China in 2025. I disagree with that assessment, but the tensions are there. So do we have 10 to 15 years? I'll let you be the judge of that. And then really it comes down to domestic processing. And then I'll just note here that with rare earth elements, what makes them so fascinating is that you can say, let's get our cobalt somewhere else. Let's get our copper somewhere else. But when you look at the largest deposit in the world of rare earths, which are really widely used, they're one of the most important sets of elements. China has the largest. So if you say, let's mine rare earths somewhere else, China could just mine more rare earths and disrupt your market dynamic. So it creates a lot of big issues that would happen. So trying to compete on the market is not just easy as mine it somewhere else, because all that China has to do is mine more of it at a cheaper rate, and companies will buy from that. You can make policies that will say you can't buy from China, but then that creates a lot of political issues where the government is intervening in industrial policy, and a lot of people disagree with that. So it creates a big issue. Here's just the display. People don't realize that you use rare earths, these evil elements, in industrial pollution scrubbers, petroleum refining, wastewater treatment, clean energy, protective eyewear, hybrid vehicles. They're used in a lot of the climate mitigation, but they're also often claimed as we need to get rid of them. It's not that easy. So then what are some of the other issues? As you probably know, if you know me in Virginia, I work a lot with the aggregate and construction industry. Aggregate mining is one of the biggest sectors in mining in the whole world. I mean, it is essential. You can't source product of aggregate far away because the cost price of transporting that wouldn't be doable. So aggregates have to be sourced locally. They're part of a local community. When you go to the Dulles Airport, that came from the Chantilly mine, which we all have and love mineral specimens from there. That came from the place, the quarry, that was responsible for building that airport. And so when we talk about more EVs, we talk about investing in the infrastructure of the United States, policies that in some cases are bipartisan in nature. You have to mine more. The problem is mining more for aggregates gets caught up and is equated to by local communities as mining for metals. There's also noise issues and other things. And so aggregates often get caught up in the big issues of mining. And so when people say, I want more infrastructure, well, let's open up a new aggregate mine or quarry. People don't want to do that. And it creates a big problem. And so it's also important to note that 8% of CO2 emissions come from the aggregate and concrete sector. So a lot of challenges, but essential for any type of innovation and future development. And if you're going to develop in Africa and you're going to bring these communities out of poverty, or South Asia, you're going to need to build roadways. That's carbon intensive and it's material intensive. Cybersecurity, I think Luckstone, for those that are familiar with the local companies here, Luckstone just came out with the first autonomous haul truck. I don't know if y'all saw that on the news. They've been really proud about that. And I spoke with one of the Luckstone guys and I said, have you ever thought about the security implications of having a haul truck that could get hacked? And he said, I've never thought about that. And there was people in a room one time. I went to the aggregate conference and spoke last year, and someone talked about having autonomous haul trucks driving down the highway. And I said, you gotta be very careful. People don't trust EVs, let alone a massive truck with aggregates, especially if there was a system malfunction. So when we think about automation, we got to keep in mind that that's a central role. And also, how the heck do you build your cyber security? I always tell my cyber friends in Washington, D.C., yeah, you can look at those computers all you want, but normally it has to be mined. It comes from an element. It comes from a mineral. And they often are like, oh, I don't know about any of that. And I'm like, yeah, you have to mine it first. Computers don't grow on trees. Uranium mining, what's the role of nuclear in the future? Of course, we have to mine uranium. So that's a big issue. Coles Hill deposit here in Virginia has been controversial for many years, a moratorium on that. For those that may be following that deposit, a Canadian company is wanting to buy up the property at Coles Hill in Pennsylvania County from the Virginia uranium, and would like to, I guess it can't really do anything right now because it's a moratorium, but would like to own the property in case the US decides to mine it. A Canadian company will be happily ready to support us in that process. And then space policy. Let's think of Star Trek. Let's go to space. Let's all get in a time machine. Let's all go travel to Mars. Let's go collect those minerals. Oh, wait a minute. All that requires materials. It requires elements. It requires minerals. So our space future, our satellite future, everything we want to do and explore, requires materials, and where are you getting it from? I hear so many people in DC talk about space policy separate from electric vehicle policy, separate from infrastructure policy. And I'm like, wait a minute, folks, are any of you writing down, I need X amount of minerals for my space policy, I need X amount of minerals for my electric vehicle policy? They're not doing that. And so these people aren't talking to one another, but they're increasing the demand for minerals, and it's creating challenges where the right hand isn't talking to the left hand. And how do you resolve that challenge? We don't know. So what's the pathway forward then? Where do we go from here? Well, if you look at the Paris Climate Accord, you look at the net zero by 2050, the United Nations plans. If you want to meet the United States, the Biden administration's EV plan, you're going to have to mine more than two times more than you're mining now to meet individual country plans. If you want to get to the Paris Climate Accord, you're going to have to mine more than 4 times than you're currently mining. And if you want to get to net zero by 2050, you're going to have to mine more than 6 times. That's just off of this supply, demand, and the materials necessary. You break down, the way you get to that math is you break down how many solar panels are being asked for in these policies, electric vehicles, fleet numbers, etc. And then you match that up with materials and what the need would be. I think we can all see here there's a challenge, because if a mine takes 10 to 15 years to open up, 2050 is on our heels. Well, what do you do? So you're going to be hit with, I hate to break it to people, on a material challenge in the next 20 to 30 years. And the goals and the ambitions are going to be limited. And there's going to have to be a lot of coming together and thinking about these things, because we're not going to be thinking the way that we need to about where we get our resources. Oil and gas was its own sector. I have a fear that the mineral and metals industry is going to go down and use the same playbook as that sector. Oil and gas people are jumping ship, and they're becoming experts in critical minerals in DC. People are trying to take that expertise of a carbon-based extractive sector over to a metals-based extractive sector. It's creating a lot of distrust and issues with local communities. So the challenges are great, and I don't want to be gloomy, but I just want to bring awareness to the actual pathways that you have to do in order to achieve it. So yes, let's get to 2050 net zero, but we're going to have to open up 150, 200 more mines in order to do that at a very, very fast rate. And if you want to do environmental quality assessments, water pollution tests, you're going to have to cut corners, and we don't want to do that. So it's going to take time, but time we don't have. There's a lot of other obstacles that we don't really include. Public education, which is an area I'm deeply involved with, educating people, permitting timelines. The lack of permitting in some cases is an issue, but also it takes 5 to 10 more years longer to do a project here than it does in Canada and Australia. What does that mean if the US wants to be independent on its resource extraction? Well, can you really do that at that rate? That's just pure economics and pure timetables. Domestic processing issues, of course, job training and market. I was told when I was at a conference in Canada recently that they were a geologist. They were speaking to a Chinese professor back in 2005. They had a conference, or I guess a field camp over out west. And the professor is like, he's like, how many graduate students or how many students do you have in your program? And he's like, what did he say? He's like 3,000. Let's just use that number. It's a conservative estimate. 3,000. He's like, wait a minute. You have 3,000 people in your whole, and he's like, no, I have 3,000 geology students in one school, folks. When you look at the numbers and look at our geology schools, which have dwindled down, which are very small numbers, Virginia Tech, where I went, it was a small department, 60, 70 people. And you have schools in China with 3,000 people. You can see that the expertise is imbalanced, and the investment in minerals have been high versus here, where when I was even in geology classes, there was a huge emphasis on coal, oil, and gas extraction. Everyone wanted to be a structural geologist. They wanted to go into the oil and gas sector. So we were investing in training in carbon and disinvesting in rare earth. And now we're trying to recoup that, but it takes time. And that's created a big job market issue, where I told my friends at Colorado School of Mines, teachers tell me all the time when I interview them, that they get students out of the door and a company wants to hire them, but the company wants to hire them at mid-level management. And these students don't know how to run an operation when they get out of college, but there's just not enough time. There's not enough expertise and training, and all the experts in the rare earth processing that are US citizens or that may have it are in their 60s and 70s. It's like the mineral community. That knowledge gap is huge sometimes. And how do you recur that and grow it is a big issue. Public opinion, we hear about not in my backyard. That's an issue I deal with every day, but it's a relevant one nonetheless. But we also have to balance those issues with other things. I won't talk about all of these because I think some of these we are familiar with. But one issue that I'm highly connected to and is really important to me is Indigenous rights, engaging with Indigenous communities. And I'll be going to Greenland in 2 months to meet with Indigenous communities, the Inuit populations, and going and camping in towns with only 30 people to try to learn where they see their future. Ice is melting, climate change is occurring, foreign governments want to come and mine their areas. How do you do that to promote investment, promote environmental quality, but also get the metals that you need? And so having these conversations are challenging, they're difficult for everyone involved, but they're necessary to come to a resolution. And negotiating and mediating is really essential. Indigenous communities are right in the middle of a lot of these mining prospects of the future, and we took advantage of them for oil and gas, and we can't do the same for them when we're looking at minerals. Green energy cannot be attributed to the same type of actions that oil and gas was. We can't do that, because what's the point then? We got electric vehicles and at the cost of what? People's culture? That's not okay. So we have to be able to face those challenges and recognize that sometimes Indigenous communities are going to have to guide and dictate where we can and cannot mine. A lot of people are open to discussion, but we can't just go mine, baby, mine. And those are things that I work on a lot. So how do we overcome? And my last point here is mineral diplomacy. And that's using minerals as a tool for public engagement. We kind of use the mineral itself to connect with different areas of interest. I always tell people that it's time to reframe minerals as a problem to part of the solution. We know as mineral collectors that every rock and mineral has a story from its creation to its extraction and into its use in a product. But people don't know that story. People don't think about that story. And here we are as mineral collectors, having and building these beautiful collections to sit in our homes and do what with? We have to be able to take these stories, share these stories, go to schools, go to communities, and tell people that these are important. Everything that you want from your cell phone that you get on TikTok with, or the laptop that you use in your class, has to be mined. And we have to think about where we mine it, how we mine it, and the balance of what we need and what we may not have to have every year, a new iPhone. These are challenges we're going to have to come to terms with. But as mineral collectors, we do that. We look at these things every day. I can't tell you how many people I've met with in Australia probably didn't even know what the rocks looked like in their own mining operation. How many geologists never even picked up a rock or mineral or had a mineral collection? They don't see it the same way we do. Not every geologist does. Not every mining company. It's money. It's product. We have to bring these companies and add value and say, look, we have a service. We can tell stories. We can use specimens to educate. And there's a value for us in this conversation, in this global issue. We can participate. We can add value. And we see this as work. People for hundreds of years have used art to explore racial issues, contemporary issues. So why can't we use art or natural art to discuss about modern issues with minerals? So we have to view it cross-disciplinary. We can't look at minerals as just geology, mineralogy. Their physics, their chemistry, their history, their geology, their geography. They're everything. They're not just pretty. So we have to frame it that way. And that's how FMVA, and we've been able to be successful, is that we've been able to tap into the industry's desire to communicate to the public why their product is important. And then we bounce it with, look, let us into quarries, let us communicate with you, take your product, turn it into education. And that way we preserve some minerals. We get people out in the field, get them interested in geology, get them out of the house where they're not on their laptops all day. And then you get the fact that you get to get people that understand what you're doing. But it has to be reciprocal. And then here, Friends of Mineralogy nationally has been trying to do a lot of stuff to show you the success. The geology of the pencil that we did had over 300,000 views, 300,000. I had friends in Australia and the UK send me this picture, and I said, oh yeah, Friends of Mineralogy did that. Making posts like this, connecting like this, finding a value in our mineral societies to talk about these issues, I think that's the future of our clubs. That's the way we get new people. That's the way we bring new blood. And that's the way we make ourselves relevant in a world that's changing. We have to change. We have to stay relevant. We have to seize that opportunity and be able to discuss these things. I will leave these things to the end if we want to have some questions, but right now I'll open it up to questions, and I appreciate everyone. Happy to talk about any specific case studies, but I want to be appreciative of everybody's time. Does anyone have any questions? Have I lost everybody?
And remember, you need to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Thomas. Oh, I got to start my video. Thank you, Thomas. What a wonderful, thought-provoking presentation you gave us, and I truly appreciate it. I really like the way you ended it with things that we can do for the future. I know from my time at USGS and Department of Energy, and I know Bureau of Land Management, these are all the policy makers. And, they interact with the State Department, with the geopolitical and everything. I guess my question is, like, it's also with trade. It's huge with trade.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and all the logistics and all of that kind of thing. So, you've got the UN, you've got the EU. This has got to be like huge discussions in the big economic conferences that they have on this. Is that what? So do we kind of got to watch them?
So it's interesting. So I'll refer you to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. As soon as the Biden administration put out the IRA, which kind of created a kind of safeguards and credits for U.S. companies, Macron and the French government came out against Biden's IRA because it kind of prioritized U.S. industry over European. So there's a big fight. There's a big fight when you talk about internationally, where everybody wants the product, everybody wants the minerals, everybody has climate goals and climate standards, but everybody's also concerned about, in Europe, Russia, the US, China, and they're safeguarding their industries. They're putting industrial policies in place, and it's making other countries mad. So my thought, I'm not going to make an assumption here, but over the next couple of years, you're going to see pushes and pulls within the United Nations, within the International Resource Panel, and within these kind of multinational dialogue systems where countries are going to start infighting with one another based off of their protectionist policies and trade policies that are going to try to incentivize domestic production over international production. So we talk a lot about working with our allies, but then when you look at the pen goes to paper, there's a lot of just, we need to focus on us. And so globalization, as it's grown over the years, is now crashing and crumbling at the international stage, where people are saying, we don't want to globalize much anymore. We want to be self-sufficient. And that's going to create trade barriers and trade issues with foreign allies. And that's going to create massive issues. Now we're talking about minerals here, so this is a little bit out of the way of the conversation people may be interested in, but it matters where we mine it, But I think, the United States, we do not have a critical minerals policy. For those that may be in DC, I'm starting some consulting work. I'm going to be on an advisory committee with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS.
Yeah.
I'll be working with them to hopefully create the US's first critical mineral strategy. UK has it, Australia has it, Canada has it, but the US doesn't. We also are very far behind. When I go to meetings often, I'm the only American in the room or that. And I will say, and I don't want to overshadow the work that USGS is doing, because they are doing work, and what DOE is doing. But at the same time, they have to follow politics, as you know, right? They're political institutions in some of those regards, and they're technical scientists. So there's a huge problem right now where scientists aren't necessarily excited to get in a Cold War discussion about what we should and shouldn't be doing with science. And so there's a lot of push and pulls that are occurring right now. So scientists are working on these issues, but does that necessarily get to DC? And do the people in DC listen to USGS? That's another thing that you probably are familiar with, Cindy. Do people in politics listen to what the DOE and USGS are putting forth?
Yes, absolutely. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? It could be about Afghanistan, Greenland, it could be about anything. If he it doesn't have to be about trade.
Hey, Thomas.
Yeah, Beth. Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good. I was thinking as you were talking about all the regulations and all, the Pebble Mine
Yeah.
permit just got shut down up in Alaska, and it has a lot of different aspects to it. The indigenous people, the salmon, pollution.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because right there.
Yep.
I was going to mention that in the recent developments, because yes, the EPA just used a rare veto block on the Pebble Mine. And we also saw the Biden administration do a moratorium on mining in the Boundary Waters Wilderness, which covers Twin Metals in Minnesota. And we also saw that Yunkin here in Virginia actually halted plans for a Ford battery plant because there was concerns with Chinese investment. So I guess all that to say in your comment is that we're talking about the need to mine domestically, but when you look what's happening, we're banning things, we're stopping things, we're not doing things. So there's still a lot of push and pull internally, despite what you hear in the news. But yeah, the Pebble Mine had a lot of those issues and it got shut down. And that's a copper gold deposit. And the Twin Metals is a copper cobalt deposit. And so copper, which we need to mine, and nickel deposits we need. The nickel deposit in the United States is being shut down in 2025. I think the Eagle mine or something like that is the last one to go out of operation. So we won't have a nickel mine in 2025, but we haven't created a new one. So we're talking about these issues as Cindy was saying, but when you look at the pen goes to paper and what's happening, we're banning, we're stopping, we're not moving, we're in gridlock, we're not having conversations, we're talking around one another, we're not listening to one another.
Thomas, we don't mind having all the minerals and elements, but we want to mess up somebody else's country.
Yeah, I don't want to be provocative.
It's
I mean,
slightly
maybe
political.
Yeah, maybe some of my talk is provocative, and I apologize for that because I try to be as bipartisan about it because it is a bipartisan issue. Well, we may think it is an issue that we care about. What I always find funny in my dialogue in DC when I'm in the Hill or I'm talking to people is that conservative Republicans, the GOP, are big supporters of domestic mining, which is the mining necessary for the energy transition, which is what the Democrats are supporting. So it's kind of ironic that the ones that are pushing for the mining for the green policy is the people that don't, it's a weird world right now. Let's put it like that. Very weird world when you try to talk to people. Kathy, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Thomas, I subscribe to Tony Nikisher's Mineral News. And recently he addressed an issue. An environmental group basically was protecting a very tiny snail on the lands in Nevada that has a very productive lithium mine locality.
Yeah.
So Tony got very vocal in his newsletter. And so, yeah, environmental groups are not helping us.
Well, let me say this, and this is what I always tell people, at the end of the day, I don't know about you all, I could live in a cabin. I can live in a cabin in the mountains and be just fine. But you know what no one's talking about in these dialogues? Consumption habits. The need to not have a new iPhone every year, the need not to have a new Tesla every 5 years, the need not to have, the fact that things go out of date and your car breaks down after 15 years. No one's having that conversation in connection with critical mineral conversations. So I would love to just say, let's stop pushing this demand, folks. Let's slow down. Let's stop consuming. Let's kind of get a grip on things and recognize that as humans, we have resource needs and we're getting a little too hungry. We're chopping off a little too much, but that conversation doesn't come up. And so the environmental groups that may have rightful concerns about what could happen at a mine site if something goes wrong are stopping their own policy of energy transitions. And that's what's so ironic here. That's what I'm saying. Like, you have Republicans in the House talking about Democrats support child labor, but they're also it's a weird world. It's a very, because I think the real issue is no one really understands minerals, right? No one really understands what's going on there. And people just think these things pop up at the Microsoft plant or the Intel plant, and there's no other need there. I think it's funny because the Intel plant, you may have seen the Biden administration invested in the Ohio semiconductor investment there. They didn't have enough materials, or they're having issues finding materials for the machines that make the semiconductors. Even the machines that make it have a supply chain, the building has a supply chain, and they just thought that they'd open up a building and the products would just show up to make semiconductors. Hello, folks. Those machines also have supply chains. So it's a domino effect, and every group wants a piece of the pie. We all have a shared future, but we're talking over one another, right? And it's American politics right now in many ways. But my goal has been, and my goal continues to be throughout my PhD, that in a time where we have to find unification in our government, an ability to talk to one another again and find common ground, minerals are that common ground. It is the issue of the future that unites us in a shared future. We just have to stop bringing up old grudges and recognize that what you want and what I want is very similar. And we just have to be willing to understand that and come to terms with that. But it's a huge challenge right now.
Yeah, the global warming argument, I do not support the global warming argument. But if you look at it, in the near term, you need nuclear.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally found an article that, why aren't we building nuclear plants right now? Well, I'm glad we're not, because it's probably not the way to go. But they say the reason is we don't have 10 years to fix the problem. It takes 10 years to build a nuclear plant, and we have to fix the problem before that. That's not a reasonable argument. That doesn't make any sense. And that's what I run into with global warming. It's nothing but silly arguments that don't make any sense. But my question to you is, you don't buy into the argument. People look at this and they say, these elements that we need, these rare earths and et cetera, there aren't enough of them to actually get the job done. You don't buy into that argument, right? You're saying we could get there. If we had the fortitude to do it, we could.
Yeah, we could get there. Yes. I don't think there's a resource concern. I think there's plenty of reserves available for what we need. But again, that all depends, because imagine this, EVs are pushing huge demands right now on supply. What happens? Think of it, folks. We had cell phones come out. That was a brand new thing that everyone talked about. EVs. What happens in 20 years from now that a new product comes out and then everyone's got to have it? So now you got another product that's pushing the supply chain. But I think there's enough out there. Like the oil, there was always peak oil, right? That there was a year that was peak oil and it go down. And as technology got better and better. What I do agree with is that the massive ore deposits that were mined during the 1900s are not there anymore. We are going, and if you look at a chart, as years go on, the ore grades decrease dramatically. So we are mining very low ore grade deposits to meet these metal demands, which result in massive tailings piles, massive amount of operations for very little material. And that's the challenge. So the material's there, but it's that they're very low quality ore deposits because we mined all the big ones. And people just think, oh, there's a nickel mine, it's here. Yeah, but maybe it's a bad nickel mine. Just because you found nickel doesn't mean it's enough, right?
Yeah, see, in my way of thinking, that for the people that do buy into the global warming, the thing that is going to fix that is solar and space. If we don't get solar and space, we're not going to be able to fix this with what we have now.
The problem with solar, what came out was that in some of the solar panels, the material used, the product of solar panels, was in Uyghur mining Uyghur camps in China. The Uyghur people, there's been human rights abuses. They were using the Uyghurs to help put the products together for solar panels. So there's human rights violations within that. So you have a group that objects to that, right? And that's the challenge. There's a group that will object to every solution that you create. And the problem is, how do you build consensus, right? That's the real challenge, is finding consensus. It's there, it exists, but it's a challenge. And anyone can say, like, you know, for pollution or water, like, let's move the climate change argument to the side, because I know that's a controversial, but let's just say that whatever you say, technology is going to advance. And we can see, whether global warming or not, technology is advancing, and every time it advances, it's more metal intensive, right? So global warming, climate change aside, advanced technology is more metal intensive than less advanced technology. Therefore, no matter the energy future you go, you need heavy amount of metals. So the problem still exists. And when you look at our supply chain today, if we stop demand, and demand never increased, we just all flatlined, we're having challenges at today's demands. We're having human rights abuses at today's demands. Like, if you just said, let's stop, we can't handle today, let alone what's going to happen 30 years from now. So, like, we can't even get our shit together, on what's today. So those challenges, whether the arguments for or against other things, still stand. And that's the real fascinating part about this. You can take away political arguments and the problem still exists. And that shows you the real severity of the challenge that we have in material needs. I did see a question here about, what is your plan to educate the youth and others who are concerned about the future of resource sharing? Dan, I am going to get to you, Dan, next. Based on the intelligence and working together on a global scale. I think it's really hard after COVID. I think COVID really, I mean, there was a couple of things. There's so many different dynamics that are going on, but I think COVID made us more global citizens than we were before COVID, because we could meet with so many people from all over the world. I mean, a lot of mineral clubs had people from Australia and all these countries come over to listen to their things. So, like, we are connected more globally than we've ever been. But from a political perspective, we are more detached than we've ever been, right? There's more of a need to do things individually. It's my country versus your country versus this. In Canada, there's something called mineral literacy organizations. I know a young, bright PhD student who I'm going to have on my podcast soon. Her name's Courtney. And she worked with a mineral literacy organization. And in Vancouver, they provide an organization very similar to FM, 1.2 million CAD every year to educate people in schools about mining and geology. We don't do anything like that in the US. Like, a mineral literacy organization would be fantastic to have here, but they're not perfect either. They have problems. But I think that we need to get the mineral community to wake up. And I'm going to be a little provocative here, but I am sick and tired as a young person being told by clubs that they can't get membership. We're in a time where minerals are on the news. It's everywhere you look. Come on, folks. This is the best time to get people to join our clubs. This is the best time to get people, but we can't look at it as, let's go on field trips all the time. We have to be able to say, if a quarry wants to let us in, what can we do for that quarry? Can we educate people in the local school about what the quarry does? And then maybe they'll let us go collect minerals. That's what FMVA does. So, like, education is going to be essential, but I think there's no other actor out there besides our groups. So my plan is to continue to go to mineral clubs and give this talk, to try to put a fire under people's butts to say, look, let's start talking about critical minerals. Let's start getting involved in this discussion. We don't have to be political about it, but we can start saying our club has a high value of educating people about what minerals are used for. We all have that knowledge here. We may not know exactly that, but we can learn it fairly easy. We know what the mineral species are. We know what the elements are. So let's do that, right? We have to be able to be a part of that dialogue, because I don't think anyone else is, to be quite frank with you. I think we're many years off from the U.S. investing in a mineral literacy organization. We also have the Mineral Council of Australia, and they put out great content. If you've ever seen their 30 things, they have great graphics and educational materials, but none of that makes it to the U.S. None of it gets into our schools. And FMVA is really working hard to provide teachers with these resources, because unfortunately, when a teacher is told to do a geology section or earth science section, guess what she does or he does? Here's the 5 different, mineral specimens. Here's the 3 different types of rocks. Let's do a Mohs hardness scale. That is not important. Anyone can learn the Mohs hardness scale. Why are we talking about minerals, folks? Why are we here in the first place? Why is it even taught? Teachers are just saying, do this, do that, SOLs. Minerals have to be talked about why they're important. So we have to stop saying, let's identify 10 minerals in my class and let's do 3 different types of rocks. Kids can learn about that. It takes 30 seconds, but let's focus on the use of minerals, why they're important, get kids to understand that. And that's what we have to do in education. And the global scale issue is very hard. I don't know. Sorry, but I'll digress. Dan, go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much. This is the second time I heard you deliver this presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And the question I had, because I don't recall it from the first time, could you elaborate a little bit on the coal ash and the rare earths that are potentially recoverable from the coal ash? Because one thing this country has plenty of is coal ash.
Yeah, no, most definitely. So when we think of coal deposits, right, we're looking at kind of swampy deposits. We have these massive coal layers. And from what I understand, as the mountains are weathering down and these coal deposits are forming, trace amounts of metals also get deposited in these deposits, not necessarily in the coal, but also in some of the sandstone and shales and the upper boundaries of these coal deposits. And so that's just from the erosion of the geology of the mountains that kind of create the coal. So, the Appalachians used to be as big as Mount Everest or the Himalayas or whatever. And those metals that basically leached out and settled into these deltas and these swamps and these deposits where coals formed, there's concentrations of rare earths in that. Cobalt as well, nickel as well. It's not just rare earths. So Penn State University in Pennsylvania was kind of the driving force behind this research. They know more than I do. So what they're looking at is when you burn coal, you have the coal fly ash, and that's basically just waste tailings at this point. And so the rare earth elements or trace amount of metals are caught up in that waste. And there's an attempt to reprocess that, I guess, using, I don't know, flotation or different metallurgical techniques to try to get those metals out. Because one of the conversations that's happened in this country is that some of the mine sites that have been mined for the last 30, 40 years, we mine for one metal and all the other metals we just put in the tailings. So they're going back and looking for different metals that are in the tailings pile. So coal fly ash was for coal, but now there's all these tailings that still have metals caught up in it. I'm assuming they're very low concentrations. So making an economic statement and like trying to make it economic and competitive with normal rare earth mining is going to be difficult. There's going to be a challenge there. But if you can scale it and you can make it happen, I think it'd be great, because what it would allow you to do is it allow you to reclaim some of the bad work that was done in the 70s on some of these coal deposits as far as environmental issues, provide jobs to the Appalachian communities in training, and teach them in more of metallurgical smelting techniques rather than just coal. But that's my idea. It's just simple geology of the metals deposit and some of these boundaries and the coal deposits. It's coal fly ash that's burned, and then there's trace amounts of metals, and then can't give you the exact percentage of how you get it out. Does that help at all?
Yeah, because you were talking a little bit earlier about a lot of people lacking the political will to get something done, but the EPA, whether you're for them or against them, they do try to do what you were just referring to, which is reclaim the land and make it more safe for people to interact with the land, whether it's schools or housing or hunting or forests or whatever. So as long as you're going to reprocess the coal ash anyway, if you could grab some of the rare earth elements along the way while you're in the mechanics of actually making the ground safer for humans, that seems like a win all around.
And I agree. I think it is a win all around. The problem, though, is getting a company to say, well, that's not as economic for me. I'm not making enough money, right? I'm just going to go mine it somewhere else, right? There has to be incentives developed within policy or credits. I mean, let's be honest, folks, whether you like it or not, it's happening. There's going to be industrial policy in the United States. It's happening today. It's going to be happening in the critical minerals. There's going to be government engagement and industrial policies and protecting certain industries and incentivizing and providing credits and subsidies for certain industries. It's just happening. It's going to happen all across the world in the critical mineral space. But it's, you know, it is a win-win, but the problem is it gets caught in politics. The moment that a Democrat proposes an idea, it becomes a bad idea, or vice versa. The moment a GOP or a conservative proposes an idea, it becomes a bad idea. So it's hard. Again, we're talking over one another here in win-win situations. People on the ground don't think like that. People on the ground in the Appalachia would be happy to have a reinvestment in their community from a mining company and be happy to be retrained in skills that would provide them jobs for the next 30 years. But it's difficult. And again, it's an economic problem, I think, at first and foremost, where how do you scale it to make a company want to invest and do it over just going overseas and getting rare earths from China, right? You're going to have to subsidize or do something. Another thing, I just mentioned this briefly because I think it's important. When I was in Australia, I don't know if you've, this is something brand new to me. Has anyone raised a hand have heard of phytomining? Okay, this is brand new research being done at the Sustainable Minerals Institute in Australia. They were in New Zealand, and they were out in the jungle, and they cut open a tree, and this bright green sap leaked out of the tree. You know what that sap was? It was nickel. It was nickel caught up in the sap that created it to be bright green. They found that specific plant species hyperaccumulate metals. They don't know how it works. They don't know the evolution behind why the plant species have hyperaccumulated, but they found that certain species will literally prosper in heavy metal soils. And so what they're doing in Australia is they're trying to find plant species that can be grown on top of tailings piles, absorb metals, cut down every year like an agricultural plant, burn and process, and get the 99% of the metals out of it. This is not going to replace traditional mining, but what it can do is it can create opportunities for reclamation, where when you have old mine tailings, you put these plants on top of it and it would soak up. But they've gotten so sophisticated in this technology. It's brand new stuff. They have an XRF gun. They take it out into the jungle and they can zap a leaf. And within 10 seconds, it gives you the chemical analysis. And there's this legume that they found in New Zealand, or no, I guess Queensland, and it had a significant zinc content. They were able to do some math calculations, estimate the ore body underneath the plants, and they actually discovered an economically viable zinc deposit using plant species with an XRF gun in the woods. I mean, this is the technology that's going to change the way that we mine, change the way that we think. But guess what? It's not changing our consumption habit and the problems about it, because you can find a zinc deposit using plants, but you can't mine it because there's the environmental concerns, right? The sulfides. So things are occurring, things are happening. There's organisms that literally the organisms that eat waste and they poop out rare earth process, like oxides. They poop out material that we can use. I mean, lots, but scaling it to make it economic is very, very, very difficult. And we tried to do it in the US and it was a failed attempt. No offense to the Department of Energy, Cindy. But there was a failed attempt somewhere out west and Australia tried to incorporate a plant species out there, and they were told, do not let it go to seed. And guess what they did? They let it go to seed. And it created an invasive species, and then they didn't really work very well on the, but they've actually found all the rare earth elements, plants hyperaccumulate. These are things from ferns to legumes to different plant species, and we've just learned about it in the last 3 or 5 years, that they will literally soak up metals and thrive in heavily toxic soils. So imagine you go to a highly toxic mine site, and they estimate that some of these like if you said, how long would it last if you just had an agricultural crop on top of mine? It could last for 30 years. It could be a job for people for 30 years. That's how long it could last. So when you look at artisanal mining in Africa, where people, when I was working on Congo, people were literally digging through the floors of their home to get metals because it was so valuable to them. These people are traditionally agricultural people, right? They farm, they herd, they do different things. Imagine telling them, we can bring you back to agricultural roots, back to your cultural heritage, artisanally mine it, and you can make money off of it. It's the way we do these things. Fred, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
Let me get Fred.
Thank you. Tom, I've heard you speak before a couple times when you did your Virginia Minerals talk. Once you came up to Chesapeake Club, and anyway, we met at one of the mineral shows. Also, you were doing an exhibit, and I was alongside of the Natural History Society. So I don't know if you remember me, but
I do remember you. Yes.
and I said, listen, this was an excellent presentation, very thought provocative, lots of interesting connections that you brought to us. I'm an educator, I'm a professor. So number one, I just want to laud you for your education slant on this. And you're absolutely right. Our schools are lacking. Some districts are better than others, but they're lacking. And we need to do that. What you said, to accumulate more membership and conjure up more interest in this is to the approach you suggested, I think was very good at that, so hopefully maybe some people take notice. Secondly, when I was in grad school many moons back, there was already a lot of bioremediation going on. Yes. And these were associated with brownfields and bioremediation of brownfields. So heavy metals would accumulate. There was a couple species of plants I remember very clearly, and I wish I could think of the name of the damn plant right now, but I can't. But then they would harvest the plant, burn it, and then the ash would have the heavy metal in it, and they could reclaim the metal that way. Was it economically feasible? I can't say to that, but the point back then was it was for bioremediation purposes in the first place. But that technology, that process has been around for a little while. It's interesting how the Australians are applying it. I didn't know that part of it.
Yeah, it's good for me to know this too. It was new to me.
Yeah.
But I think it came out in Maryland, right? The guy that did all this was in Maryland University or somewhere, right around here.
I think so. And a lot of the places they were doing this was the old former industrial fields in Delaware, DuPont's.
Yeah.
Contaminated areas, So anyway, that's been around, but I'd like to see, maybe some of the applications that you suggest would be pretty cool. Now, you were talking, and this other gentleman, Mike, had talked about nuclear power. We have so much uranium in this country, it's not funny. The Colorado Plateau is just filled with uranium. And I don't see why we don't use more nuclear power. I mean, there's a public fear for that, obviously. However, I just want to say, here we have France. France gets 75% of their energy needs from nuclear. Man, if the French can do it, why can't we? And I've always said that. If the French can do it, why can't we? I mean, they get 75% of their energy from nuclear, and they handle the waste just fine. They store it, but of course, nuclear waste can also be recycled and reused. But anyway, we're not doing that, and I don't know why.
I'd like to talk about that really, really quick, because I think it's a fascinating story. So are you familiar with the Coles Hill deposit in Pennsylvania County in Virginia?
I've only heard of, I can't say I know about it though.
So they say it's a big, large deposit. I think the ore grade's fairly not like fantastic, but they've been wanting to do this for years. I mean, back in the 50s. And what's happened, it's been hilarious. It's not hilarious in a good way, but kind of one of those ironic, funny situations where they attempted to mine it. They were going through the policies, and Chernobyl occurred. No, I'm sorry, doing the policies, and then Three Mile Island accident occurred in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And then it went a moratorium, and they tried to do it again, and then Chernobyl happened. And then in 2010, whatever, they tried to do it again, and Fukushima happened in Japan. Every attempt they made when it got to the point of policy, nuclear disaster occurred. Now, when you look at the statistics, you're very right, Fred, that statistically, nuclear is way safer than traditional energy methods. When you look at the mining and different things, I mean, it is a very safe method. And I think it is in many ways a way forward. I think nuclear is going to provide a lot of opportunities. I also tell people too, that electric vehicles don't create energy. Electric vehicles store energy. I think a lot of people that go and get their vehicles charged think that energy, electricity is coming from the electricity tree, but a lot of it's coming from coal plants, right? Or maybe a
Absolutely.
nuclear plant. So yeah, you have to have that base load power, which I think nuclear is the best way to do it. You see a lot of investment or interest in those small modular nuclear reactors, right? I think Bill Gates or others are looking at something like that. So I think nuclear personally is a way to go. I think that, yes, we have a lot of opportunity to do it. But what happened, I don't know if you're following the news the last 2 days. Did you hear about the uranium? It's like cesium-127 that got misplaced in Australia. I think it was yeah, people are not in. Yeah, Rio Tinto on the middle of transport lost a vial of cesium-127 or whatever the isotope was. And it created this media storm, and boy, that set us back a little bit in the and the nuclear thing. So they did find it. Yeah, David, they found it today, didn't they? It came out in the news. It was found today.
I would think to be able to find that.
Well, it was small. It was like this big. I mean, I was like, what? And like, this is, but they went all in a fuss over something that big. It wasn't even an inch. It wasn't even half an inch.
The size of a pea.
Yeah, size of a pea. And they freaked out, and it went all over the news and went viral. People were talking, this is why nuclear is bad. This is why we shouldn't do nuclear. And every time something happens in nuclear, something goes wrong. But I think people don't hear about mining accidents. They don't hear about things that happen at quarries or different things like that go on every day. I know a lot of people in the quarry industry, when I've been doing this stuff in Virginia, that have known someone that's died or someone at another quarry that's passed away with mining accidents. It's a very challenging issue. Yeah, it's a very bad one. Yeah, cesium-137. And you know, it's a big issue. It's a big issue. But I think nuclear is the way to go. But I will say the coal steel uranium here in Virginia, it's fascinating that the Canadian company has come and offered to buy it. I don't know if anyone's familiar with ownership of the mineral mining companies in Virginia. We have Kyanite, which is the largest producer of kyanite for the whole United States. That's a U.S. company based in Willis Mountain. Mineral people go collect there. You have the vermiculite operation, which is Virginia vermiculite. That's a U.S. company. But the gold mine that's in Buckingham, that's very, very highly disputed there. There was a National Science Foundation report that came out like a month ago about why we shouldn't mine gold in Buckingham County. It's a big, big report. That is a Canadian company. Canada wants to purchase the uranium mine, and Youngkin supported and is investing in $82 million in investment for the first titanium recycling plant to open up in Halifax County. And that's a group called Empyrean X, who's operated from an Australian company. And what I noticed is a lot of these companies, what they do is they're based in a foreign country. They create a company in the United States, and then it goes on the news. They're a U.S. company. It's not a U.S. company. It's a foreign company that has created a business in the United States. But it's a big issue. And I've seen videos of the town halls of the Coles Hill, and they brought an environmental expert from out west who was an environmentalist. And he said, why should we be mining it here when we can mine it in Kazakhstan? And I'm like, boy, that's a bold statement. An authoritarian regime that treats its people awfully, and you're saying, let's just get it from Kazakhstan. So massive issues. But again, we're talking over one another. But I do believe uranium is a good way forward. You need that baseload power.
I'm glad somebody agrees.
But again, I'll say this too, though. But you talk about market dynamics and like people putting doubt. Someone told me the other day when I went to a conference that like every day they get on their desk, a company, so many new technologies that can threaten their technology. And a lot of them are just daily scares. They almost get used to it. Like, oh, it's going to be a disruptor. Oh, maybe it's not going to be whatever. But it comes up daily. But when you heard about the fusion reaction that occurred, the little small reaction, it went on the news, everyone was talking about it. That disrupts the investment in nuclear because people, well, wait, let's just wait another 30 years for fusion, right? Or another 100 years for fusion. So all these different dynamics and disruptive technologies are messing with one another. And it really creates a cloudiness around what do you do? What do you invest in? What should I put my millions on? What should I invest my taxpayer dollars on? Like part of me feels like we are very not right to be investing in the lithium. Like people want to invest in lithium and maybe that's a good idea for now, but 30, 50, 60 years from now, maybe hydrogen, you know, like what do you do? I mean, you invest millions of dollars in taxpayer funds when a technology can come up in 20 years. It's a very volatile industry. So the nuclear thing, people just say, let's just wait till the next thing. Forget nuclear, just forget nuclear, you know. Beth, go ahead. Sorry.
You can't keep kicking the can down the road. That's the
You can't. You
problem.
can't. Oh, you can. But we're good at doing that here in the U.S.
Okay, I've been
Right.
collecting some thoughts as the different discussions have been going on here for the last little bit or so.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm from Oregon, so hydro is the way to go as far as I'm concerned. We tried to have some nuclear plants up on the Columbia and they got shut down. But so I still think hydro is the way to go. But not everybody can because you don't have the water.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not an all fits all, right?
Yeah.
Energy grids depend on what you have and what's available geologically.
We've got
Okay.
solar on our house, so we're already trying to go as green as possible. But you talked about using the plants for mining. A long time ago, they used to try to decide where to mine by walking across the land and seeing the change in the plants. Certain plants would grow where certain minerals were. And so it's not a new thing. It is an old thing that's renewed, I guess.
Oh yeah, they always say, what's the definition of insanity? You know, like
Yeah.
talking about the same thing over and over and over. We've been here. We've had this conversation. There's been critical mineral people that talked about this 30 years ago, 50 years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
you're beating your head against the wall, but it's worth beating your head against the wall. I mean, literally, these are major challenges that are going to face the way we consume, the way we operate, and really the way that we advance our society. I mean, I want to write a paper sometime or do a graphic on the minerals necessary for like the Star Trek Enterprise. Like what would be, because like you think about all these sci-fi movies of like, oh, let's have this big, what would it take? Like how
We
much
haven't
minerals would it
found the
take? And like,
lithium
did you even have
crystals
that?
yet.
Huh?
We haven't found the lithium crystals yet.
Exactly, right? We don't have the crystals for the source of power. But like, again, though, we forget like all these futures we create for ourselves.
Mhm.
We go in our policy circles and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And then it's all based on a material need that nobody thinks about.
Yeah.
Nobody even looks at. And I always tell people, I always think that if you're going to write a national defense strategy, this is my big preach up in DC. If you're going to do an NDS, you're going to do an infrastructure bill, you're going to do all these different things, you better damn in the future, in the next 10 years, I want to see a resource assessment on all these reports on what your needs are going to be to accomplish what the hell you want. Because nobody puts that in those reports. They say, I want this, this, and this, but what's the necessary material need to accomplish the said policy directive you're putting forth? Nobody does that. And that is a big problem in a world that we exist in. By the way, Jeff, we will start it in February. We're hoping to have Aaron Pauk of GIA for our February speaker series.
The third
Okay, great,
very
thanks.
quick thing is you mentioned the controversy between environmentalists and the miners and such. I hit that controversy at least once a week because I love the program Gold Rush, but every time they start pushing all those trees over and knocking them down in order to clean off the overburden, I just cringe. So
Yeah.
it's you get the gold, but look at all those trees we lost.
Oh, you have people, I think it's fascinating. You have people that are anti what's the word? I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here, but like anti tree cutting, I get what's the word,
Mhm.
proper word?
Tree huggers.
Well, no, I guess not tree huggers. I'm saying like people that do not like the tree cutting industry or kind of that side of thing, the logging industry.
Yeah.
But they
Oh,
like the
okay.
mining industry. And you have people like the mining industry that don't like the logging industry, right? So you
Mhm.
get people that will take a hill to die on that seems counterintuitive. I mean, I think really the problem is that as a society, we've forgotten what it takes to make what we use every day.
Mhm.
And we have to come to terms with that. And we have to wake up that what we want takes materials and minerals, and where they come from and how they get to us and who mines them matters a lot. And we can't overlook that. I mean, here's what this is the thing that always, I was in Australia and we got to meet with indigenous communities. I got to speak with some elders on Stradbroke Island, which is a big titanium sand mining operation on the east coast. And we spoke with the elder, and that guy was employed by the mining sector, and he thought of it very positively. But there's also people on the island that think of it very negatively. So, and even within that community, there's a push and pull of what to do and what not to do. But one of the things that I think is so funny is that for rural communities who often are not the people that require these metals. I mean, let's be honest. The people that want all these Teslas and stuff are in the city centers. They're in the big, massive metropolises and all those things. But who is mining it? The rural communities. And so here we went through a whole coal industry, a whole gas industry, a whole petroleum, natural gas, whatever, where we went to the rural communities and we told them, you're going to produce the materials and energy that is going to support the big cities. But when you look at the amount of people in a rural community that get to go to college, that don't have economic issues, drug issues, they are completely left out of all the goods that came of all the stuff that happened with the coal and gas industry. They get left with all the environmental problem. And here we are with the green energy sector now going back to the Native Americans, going back to the Aboriginals of Australia, going back to the rural communities of Appalachia and telling them, here we are once again, telling you that you're going to mine the future for us. We're going to benefit from that future and you're going to live in that small community. That's not what it's going to work. It can't work like that. You're going to have to offer these people a better stand, a better cut of the pie. And you're not going to just let the mining company come in and 30 years go away and you don't have anything. So the rural communities have always been asked to mine the materials for the big cities, the people that use it. And that's the same concept of people in Africa. We come to Africa, Shell went in Nigeria, we're going to mine, we're going to get the oil out, we're going to destroy the environment, we're going to do all these things. And then we're now going to ask you to start mining gold for us. We're going to ask you to start doing this for us because we need green energy. What was the difference there to these people? These people see no difference. These people see people coming in for their resources and not providing opportunity. So there's a lot of entrenchment and distrust and negotiations that have to occur. And that's where I would like to spend my time on my PhD, is getting to know these stakeholders and trying to find a resolution. It's not easy. I hit my head against the wall every day. I wake up, but it's worth that conversation. It has to be worth that conversation. I know so many people that were on their phones when we were in Australia that were like anti-mining. We went out there and I had a lot of undergrads. I was a PhD student there. And all the undergrads were environmental students. Of course, all of them did not like mining, but they took this mining field camp. And they were all out there posting their TikTok images, getting their Instagram photos. And I was like, And they're like, bad mining's bad. We need to stop these metal mines. This stuff is just awful. And I was like, honey, do you know what the heck is in your phone? Like, what are you doing? Like, I mean, everything you use, your whole existence can't be operated without that. I mean, that's the challenge of the future. But that's why I believe, and I'll end it here if there's no other questions. I think that the mineral community, if we're going to evolve and we're going to find a space to exist, it has to be here. It has to be educating people about why minerals are important and using our mineral specimens. And maybe, just maybe, we can convince these companies to save some, to let us dig some safely, to actually use them to educate people, right? Don't just destroy it. I mean, all these new mines are going to open up. If they open up, there's going to be lots of minerals. And we got to be able to say, look, they can be useful. They can be great communication devices or communication tools. So let's do it. So, by the way, this is a fake. Yeah, this is not real behind me. So yeah, any other questions? I know we've taken a long turn here. It's been 9:30, but I appreciate the questions. I really do. If anyone has any others, I'm happy to entertain them. And you're always welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn and reach out to me via email. If you have any questions about critical minerals, happy to assist.